Hello and welcome to our module on Catholic social teaching. As will probably not come as any real surprise, in this module we're going to be learning about Catholic social teaching, but more importantly we're going to be concluding our whirlwind introduction to Catholic ethics and Catholic worldview. And in the next module we'll be looking briefly at the history of 20th century agriculture in America, and then moving on to look at the specific topics that we're going to be focusing on for the remainder of the course. So what we need to do today then is to draw on what we've already learned about the Catholic worldview, theological anthropology, and also natural law in the last couple of modules, and focus it specifically on how we ought to deal with big social issues, big social systems like businesses, government, and communities, and things like that. And that's really what Catholic social teaching is about. It's about taking the moral principles that we've talked about in the last few modules and thinking about how we should apply them to big social choices, big social actions, instead of kind of individual choices about should I lie or not. We have to look at choices about what should corporations do, or what should the minimum wage be set at, or what kind of laws about the environment should be passed. That's where Catholic social teaching really focuses, and where it's intended to provide some guidance in making those kinds of choices. And you can see here on a page a picture of Pope Leo XIII, and he's there because it's really with Leo XIII in the late 1800s that Catholic social teaching came into existence as a particular discipline, a particular school of thought. Now, obviously, if you've been around Christianity at all, or if you've read the Bible, clearly there's a lot of material in the Bible long before the late 1800s that deals with the kinds of issues that Catholic social teaching does. Care for the poor, care for immigrants, all these kinds of things. Those are concerns of Catholic social teaching, and they are in the Christian tradition from the very beginning. But it really begins to be spelled out in terms of kind of a system, and a system to be applied to specific policy choices with Leo in the late 1800s. And the reason it comes into existence at that point, if you'll recall from maybe some of your world history courses, is that that's when industrialization is really getting underway, particularly in Europe at that time. And you can see here again on the page some pictures of child laborers from that period in the Industrial Revolution. And obviously, as you might recall, there were a lot of different abuses going on as that whole Industrial Revolution kicked off, particularly in terms of the treatment or mistreatment of workers. But there were also a lot of other social problems that came from large numbers of the poor coming to cities, working in factories, living in really poor conditions in the cities. So there was a lot of social upheaval, a lot of problems. And this is also when you get a handful of very rich industrialists and businessmen who are accumulating a great deal of power, and you're seeing these large quantities of urban poor in kind of a new way for the first time in history. So that's what prompts Leo to write this important document called Rerum Novarum, which is just Latin for on the new things, referring to these new things that are going on in the economy and with the Industrial Revolution. And what he does in that document, which we're not going to take the time to go through here at the moment, but he goes through and looks at a lot of the impacts of these changes on the poor, and criticizes many of those things, and gives some guidance for changes that should be made. And so it's critical of many of the powerful people at the time, not named individually, but it's certainly critical of a lot of what's going on at that time, and calls for some real social changes to improve the lives of the poor at the time. Now, obviously, not everything that was recommended in that document was carried out, but it did have an important impact, and it had an impact in particular in the larger Christian tradition to prompt Christians to think seriously about these issues and about how the modern economy affected the poor and how we ought to address them as Christians. And so all of the things that we're going to talk about for the remainder of the module, and really to a large extent for the remainder of the course, can in some way be traced back to Rerum Novarum and Pope Leo in the late 1800s. Now, the most fundamental principle that makes up Catholic social teaching is really the principle of human dignity. And there are a lot of different formulations of the principles of Catholic social teaching. If you search online, you could probably find a decent number of different lists of what the principles are. But as with some of the other things we've looked at, there's some variation in wording. There might be a different principle or two in the list, but there's a fairly standard set of principles. And in pretty much all of those different lists, the very first principle is going to be human dignity, because that's really the foundation of Catholic social teaching as a whole. And this is pretty much exactly the same kind of idea that we saw when looking at natural law, right? This idea that each human person has an intrinsic value, an intrinsic worth, an intrinsic dignity that we can't violate, right? And when we say it's intrinsic, that means they have it just because they are a human being, right? That you don't need to be have any particular abilities. You don't have to be so productive or not. You don't have to meet any sort of special criteria. Just by being a human person, you have this dignity, this value that should not be violated. And you should not be treated basically as a tool or as something to be used for some other goal or purpose. As a human person, each person deserves to be treated as a person, as an equal to whoever is making a particular decision or carrying out an action. And that's really the foundation of Catholic social teaching, right? And the real challenge that Catholic social teaching looks to help us address is, okay, we can all recognize that perhaps in our daily life, right? That we need to recognize that the people we interact with are really individuals and human persons. And we need to treat them like that, even if it's the teller at the store or somebody you talk to on the phone or somebody that you're jostling in line with somewhere. We can all recognize that there are often challenges in our daily life treating everyone we interact with as a person. And we do more or less well at that, depending on the day, perhaps. But at least we can make a genuine effort there. It seems like it's something that you could actually accomplish if you really set your mind to it. This problem becomes larger and more difficult once you step back and think about our roles in all kinds of different social institutions or social systems, right? That in many ways we affect not just the people that we physically see or talk to every day, we affect far more people beyond that, right? When I go to the grocery store and buy a gallon of milk, or when I go to Walmart and buy a pair of socks, I don't see the people who produce the milk, transport it, sell it. I don't see the people who grow the cotton, who make it into fabric, who make the socks, who package them, who ship them, right? But my purchase of the socks or my purchase of the milk affect a whole host of people that I will probably never really see. Or when I go to the polls and I vote and pick a particular senator or a particular president, that choice is going to affect millions, if not billions, of people. And so that's a pretty daunting task to think about. How can we recognize and respect the dignity of all the people that we affect with our choices and actions? And that's what Catholic social teaching seeks to help us do, right? It gives us, kind of like some of the principles we looked at last time, double effect and legitimate cooperation. It's not a magic formula, it's not a magic equation where we can just pop a situation into Catholic social teaching and outspits the right answer, what it does is it gives us a list of principles to use as a way of working through these kinds of choices and thinking about how we live and how we act as consumers or voters or employees or whatever it might be. And so, again, we're probably never going to be perfect at that, but that's what we should be aiming at, is to think about when I participate in an economic system or political system or what have you, to really try to think about everyone involved in it as a real person. And what can I do? How can I act that's really going to promote the good of all these different persons involved with and affected by the system in question? And, the most important thing and the most immediate thing to be concerned about is to really recognize that when we are involved in these different systems, that should always be our focus, is how can we truly help people? How can we truly help the persons involved in this business or involved in this community or this government? And everything else comes second, right? So attaining profit, attaining political power, whatever it might be, those things aren't necessarily wrong or bad in any way. But our real focus needs to be, how do we promote the good of people? How should we set up our business in a way that's going to improve the lives of the employees, and the customers, and all the other people affected? That should be our real focus. And then we should think about, okay, how do I make this sustainable to make a profit? Or how do I set up the government in such a way that it's really going to help people? And then we can think about perhaps setting it up so that it gives us some other goods as well, like prosperity or more time in office or whatever it might be. So that's, in a nutshell, what Catholic social teaching is really about. Now on the following pages, I want to go through some of the other particular principles. One of the primary things that Catholic social teaching is concerned with is how we use resources and how we use money and how we set up the economic systems in our society. And if you think about just the principles that we've already talked about up to this point, these principles of the common good or the universal destination of goods follow pretty directly. We've talked about before in terms of natural law that when we're making choices, we need to act or choose in a way that's going to promote the true good of everybody that's affected by this choice. And we've also talked about how we need to seek the good of people over and above and before we worry about profit or our individual accumulation of wealth. And so these first couple of principles that make up Catholic social teaching after human dignity are really just the application of those ideas to economic issues and to looking at material resources. Right? So the principle of the common good is basically a principle that says when we are making choices, when we are acting in different social systems or institutions, we need to act in a way that promotes the common good. Right? And again, this just follows from this obligation to work for the real good of people. But I think one thing to point out here, right, is that this isn't just simply saying, okay, we should look at what's going to maximize profit for this guy and this guy and this guy and this guy and me. It's not just a collection, really, of individuals and figuring out, how can we make sure that each individual comes out of this thing with a profit. In a real way, this is aiming at how can we build and promote a common good, or if you use some old-timey English, the commonwealth, right? People used to talk about the commonwealth as a way of talking about the state, the community. But built into that term, the commonwealth, right, is this idea that there are important resources, there's important wealth that is shared in common, right, which would often be common grazing lands or forest or whatever it might be, that there were resources shared by the community that benefit everyone in the community, but that they also bring together and kind of tie together the different members of the community, right? And so those of you of a more political persuasion, who maybe listen to a lot of talk radio, your ears might be perking up at this point because in a lot of ways this idea runs contrary to much of modern American economic thought, right? Many Americans really focus on the idea of privatization, right? We don't want kind of common or governmental control of things. It should all be private, it should all be individual, right? And any talk about communal property instantly raises kind of all kinds of red flags. Oh, this is socialism or communism or what have you. And again, there are certainly people who talk about common good in a way that really is aiming at some of those kind of scary ideas like socialism. But at the same time, looking at Catholic social teaching as a Christian body of thought, there is real precedence in the Christian tradition for this idea of common property, of a common wealth that draws the people together. Most famously in the New Testament book of Acts, where the early Christians, at least one community of them, seem to have sold most or all of their individual possessions, and they pooled them together to share them amongst their fellow believers. Now, again, I don't think any Catholic social teaching scholars are really advocating that sort of a drastic move at this point. But to say that any sort of common sharing of property is communist or socialist and un-American and un-Christian is just clearly false, right? That there are real precedents for common sharing of goods in the Christian tradition. Again, you can see that illustrated here in the picture with the example of the Amish, right? That these are certainly not commies by any stretch of the imagination, but one of the distinctive features of the Amish as a particular Christian community is that they do come together and share resources and share especially labor for the good of everybody. And so one of these principles of Catholic social teaching is this idea of the common good, right? We don't just work for individual profit. We aim for the good of everybody, not just as individuals, but as a real common community. Now, like with all the different Catholic ethical principles we've looked at, this is a principle. This is a something that we should be aiming at. It's a goal. The nitty-gritty details of how we bring that about, tax codes or property laws or whatever that might be, that's not something that Catholic social teaching is going to lay out for us, right? Catholic social teaching and Catholic ethics in general will talk about the importance of prudential judgments, right? Prudence is the ability to figure out how to actually implement your ideals and live up to your principles, right, in terms of real, practical, concrete details, right? So Catholic social teaching is proposing this idea of the common good as a principle that we should follow and aim for, but it leaves up to the people in the world, the experts, and the informed citizens to come up with the means to actually make this happen. Right? So this doesn't mean Catholic social teaching supports, the Democrats' tax plan or the Republicans' tax plan or whatever it might be. It's a principle that we should be aiming for, and honestly aiming for, but we leave the details up to the prudence of voters, the prudence of experts, and those making the decisions. Okay. Along with this principle of the common good, there's also this idea of the universal destination of goods. And this is something we've already touched on in the last module when we talked about thou shalt not steal, right? And the idea that there can be certain circumstances where people will claim to have something as their private property where they don't really have a right to that property, and that in that situation is not really stealing to take that property from them, right? And this is kind of the underlying Catholic social teaching principle behind that. The universal destination of goods says if we look at the Catholic worldview, if we look at Scripture and the Christian tradition, we can see that the world and all of its resources are created for the good of all people, right? So God creates the world; He makes creation for the good of people, and that we need to keep that in mind as we go about our lives and as we set up our economic and commercial systems, right? So this is going to mean that, yes, there is an individual right to private property according to natural law, but that is in some ways secondary, and it is limited. So that if you get some person or some group claiming more and more and more property to the point where they are taking that property away from the universal good of everyone, that can become an illegitimate accumulation of property, right? And or to look at it more positively, you can say those who have wealth, those who accumulate property, have an obligation to use it for the good of everyone, right? You can't be like Scrooge McDuck here and just swim around in your big piles of gold. All wealth, all goods need to be used for the good of everyone, the good of people. And this also means, right, just because you work hard and accumulate something doesn't mean, again, you have an unconditional right to get more and more and more. The spoils don't always go to the winner, at least in God's plan as laid out in Catholic social teaching, right? That there needs to remain the possibility for everyone to have access to some land and some minimal amount of property that would be necessary for them to care for themselves and to flourish as individuals. Right? So if you have somebody who sets up a monopoly, particularly in terms of land or in general productive resources, that wouldn't fit with Catholic social teaching, right? That all people need to have access to the property that they need in order to care for themselves, to care for their families, and to flourish as human beings. Now again, this doesn't mean everyone has to have the same amount of money, or that we take all money over X amount from the rich and give it to the poor. Again, this is a guiding principle that says we need to really seriously think about how we use our wealth and make sure it is really used for the good of all. So this may very well lead to some what would appear to be drastic changes in our economic system if we took this seriously, but it's also not endorsing any particular political or economic system. There needs to be a balance between recognizing people's right to private property, but also the need of everyone to have the property necessary to care for themselves and their families. All right, so we will leave those principles for the time being, and we can certainly talk about them more on Blackboard, but let's go ahead and move on. The principles on the last page really focused on the use of money, the use of resources. The principles on this page focus a bit more on people's voices being heard, people's political power, but also beyond that, people's ability to influence the decisions that matter in their life, in political realms, but also in economic and social. And so I want to walk us through these three principles briefly, because again, these will be important as we look at some of the various issues related to food in America in the 21st century. So in no particular order here, we have participation, subsidiarity, and solidarity, which are all interconnected in different ways. If we look at the principle of participation, what is this principle? Well, this principle says if we take seriously this idea that each person has this intrinsic value, has this dignity that shouldn't be violated, that's going to mean that each person has the right to make choices for themselves, has the right to have a say in the choices and decisions that are going to affect them and affect their families. So the principle of participation says that we need to have means for everyone to participate in decisions that are important to them and their loved ones, right? So most obviously this comes up in the political realm, right? Where everyone, at least everyone who is old enough to be reasonable, should have participate in the big decisions of a society, right? So you could certainly say that there is support in Catholic social teaching for the basic idea of democracy, right? That everyone should be able to have a say in the important decisions that affect them. But as I mentioned a moment ago, participation isn't just about politics, right? That it also is true in other realms of life, like the economic, social. And so this would mean that, say, workers in a large company should have some means for having a say in the decisions that are going to affect them. Or people in other different communities that aren't necessarily a government should have a say in the different organizations that they're a part of that affect their lives. And again, all of this goes back to, this isn't just a political idea, this isn't just saying yay democracy. This is again rooted in that basic belief that each person has this dignity that needs to be respected, and so we need to give them the ability to participate in decisions. One of the interesting places that this comes up in is when we think about charity and charity work in, say, third world countries, where you'll have some American nonprofit or rich people from the developed world will go in and want to set up system, school system, or health system, whatever it might be, which of course is in and of itself a basically good thing. But Catholic social teaching would say we still need to follow this principle of participation, right? That we need to give the people who are living there a real voice in what's going to go on and what's going to be developed and created. So there can be this real challenge in charity work where it can be a struggle to make sure that people still are able to participate in the decisions, that everything isn't being dictated by experts from different parts of the world or from different social classes. Now again, you could argue, well, look, the experts really know best what's going on, and these people, whoever they might be, don't really know what's in their best interest. Now again, obviously a lot of people would criticize that type of thinking as kind of prejudiced and colonial and all kinds of bad things. But you could also look at it simply from this perspective of Catholic social teaching, say even if it were true, right, part of what allows human beings to flourish, to fulfill their nature, become what they were meant to be, is to give them some real control over their lives, over the lives of their families and communities, so that even if what they would choose is not going to be what the experts would say is the best way to set up this particular system, there is a value in giving people control over their lives that really contributes to their overall good and well-being. Connected with this is the idea of subsidiarity. And this is perhaps the least familiar of these principles, right? I think if you came up with a list of Catholic social teaching principles and just wrote out the names, for most of them, you'd probably be able to guess more or less what it was going to say. But for many people, you wouldn't really know what this idea of subsidiarity is about. But subsidiarity is a principle that says when we're setting up social institutions, and in particular when we're deciding how decisions will be made, where power will be located, we ought to always prefer the smallest, most local, most personal level possible, right? So when we are figuring out how we're going to make our political choices, we ought to prefer the small and the local over the big, the national, and the international, right? And basically, all choices should be made on the smallest scale possible, unless it's impossible to do that, right? So, for example, military decisions and policy can't be decided in the U.S. on a kind of village-to-village basis, right? You just can't have a coherent military or military plan that way. There needs to be a kind of national organizing body that has the power to make those decisions. But there are lots of other decisions that can be handled on a smaller scale, on a more local level. The principle of subsidiarity says whenever that's possible, that's what you ought to do. Now, why on earth is this a principle of Catholic social teaching? Right? This really seems, maybe more than even any of the other principles, to be a sort of a political idea. Right? That this sounds like something you might hear on, again, certain channels of talk radio, and it doesn't really sound like something that come out of the mouth of Jesus. Right? We can see Jesus saying, "Care for the poor," or recognize the dignity of your fellow man, or something like this. But preferring local political organization doesn't really sound like something Jesus might say in the Gospels. And, I think there's some validity to that. But the idea, I think, is there, right? And it does kind of follow from the basic ideas of the Catholic worldview and theological anthropology, right? That, again, the focus is on persons, right? And promoting the real good of persons. The real challenge of big social institutions is that no matter how well-intentioned you are, people tend to turn into numbers, right? It's just very difficult for the President of the United States to recognize and promote the value of individual persons when you have roughly 300 million of them. It's much easier to recognize the personhood and dignity when you're talking about a small town or community, right? And so there's a kind of inherent danger in big social institutions to become less and less personal, more and more statistics-driven, number-driven, which again is not necessarily bad, but carries with it a kind of real danger of getting away from that idea of recognizing and promoting the dignity of human persons. And so this principle of subsidiarity is a way to minimize that danger, right? To really get people to focus on the personal level, personal relationships as much as possible. Right? Again, this is not just politics. This would be true also in the business world, right? And so, you often hear people of different political persuasions arguing for we should prefer small stores over big chains like Walmart. And again, this isn't to say, yes, Catholic teaching says Walmart is evil. But it does say maybe there is something to this idea besides just the nostalgia for the past, or you kind of have some liberal political leaning so you don't like Walmart. There is this idea of keeping things personal does have a real value from the perspective of Catholic ethics and social teaching. All right, finally, this principle of solidarity is kind of in some ways the inverse, if you will, of subsidiarity, right? And this is thinking about what about those people who aren't close to us, who aren't local, who may be in another country or in a very different social class, or just separated from us in a significant way. The principle of solidarity says that we need to recognize the personhood and dignity of those people, even though they are far removed from ourselves, right? And so, again, you probably heard this in different political contexts about having solidarity with workers in the third world, solidarity with, those struggling for freedom in the Middle East, or whatever it might be. And that's the basic idea, is that while in some ways we ought to focus on the local and people we can really interact with as persons, we still need to recognize the personhood of those very distant from us. And when we're making decisions that connect us with them, we need to especially keep that in mind. And of course, in some ways, this is much easier in the modern world. We can see people on the other side of the world instantaneously, or talk to them, very easily. So solidarity is in some ways much easier today than it would have been in the past, back when Pope Leo was first writing about these ideas. At the same time, it also is much more important and much more necessary, right? Because, there's a real way in today's world where what a farmer here in Kansas decides to do can really impact another farmer on the other side of the world. And so solidarity is very important, in today's world because we are so interconnected with other people. The next principle I want to talk about is the principle of stewardship. And I've given this its own separate page because this is going to be a particularly important principle for us as we go through and look at issues related to agriculture in modern America. Stewardship, for those of you who are Catholic or who may be familiar with the Catholic community here in Wichita, is something that comes up an awful lot. The Diocese of Wichita was the first diocese in the U.S. to champion this principle of stewardship as a way of talking about how individual Catholics ought to contribute to the church through their time, through their talent, and through their treasure. So other churches will talk about tithing. And we'll talk about tithing through time and talents as well. But Catholics, especially here in the Diocese of Wichita, will talk about this in terms of stewardship. Right? And there is a connection here with the principle of Catholic social teaching, although it's not a direct one. Right? That when Catholics here in Wichita talk about stewardship, it's giving your time, giving your money, giving your talent to the work of the church. But when you're doing that, right, what you're doing, or what you should be doing, not like grudgingly saying, all right, I got to do this, is you are really using what you have, again, to promote the good of the community, both the local Catholic community, but also the larger community as well. And so that's connected to this idea of stewardship in Catholic social teaching as well, that we should use and care for the resources we have in a way that really promotes the good of everyone. Now, in Catholic social teaching today, stewardship can have this kind of general reference to caring for any resources, but really the focus tends to be on talking about this principle of stewardship in connection with the environment, right? So that when we talk about the principle of stewardship, we're most often talking about the idea that we as human beings and as, again, part of these social institutions of a particular nation or a particular company or consumers with a particular company, that we ought to act in a way that preserves these resources for the good of everyone. Right? So one thing to note here at the beginning is that this principle of stewardship differs in an important way from at least some forms of environmentalism. Right? There are lots and lots of different people who could be called environmentalists, and that they can have very different ideas about what that means and how they should act accordingly. But there are certainly some environmentalists today who basically take the view that the good of the environment, of the natural world, so to speak, comes first, right? And that human beings are, if anything, really just seen as a danger or a threat or something to be kind of minimally tolerated. And really the goal is to get every different ecosystem kind of back to the way it was before there were human beings around it, really to minimize as much as possible human presence and human involvement in the natural world. Now, perhaps not surprisingly, that's not going to be the Catholic perspective. That's not what this principle of stewardship aims at, right? And really the whole idea of stewardship is in some ways built around the idea, again, that we get from Genesis, right? With God creating the world and then kind of handing it over to Adam and Eve as stewards. The idea is that while the created world, while nature and animals and plants have a real value, have a real goodness that should be respected, at the same time, the natural world in the biblical account and in the Christian tradition, in a real way, also exists for the good of human beings, right? So that when we talk about stewardship, we are caring for the land and the environment and the animals because they are good things that God has created. But we also, importantly, care for them because by caring for the natural world, we are caring for other people. We are caring for other people in the world today, and also, perhaps most importantly, preserving this good of the natural world for future generations as well. So this is a care for the environment, but it's also care for the environment that includes a strong emphasis on how by doing that we are caring for other people. And again, this is rooted in the biblical tradition. You can find it in Genesis. You can find it really kind of throughout the Old Testament, right? God gives the people all kinds of commands about how they are to care for the land. And if they care for the land, in return, they will be blessed, right? And again, you don't need to be a member of Greenpeace to recognize that there are real benefits for people in providing at least some care for the natural world, right? If you just dump toxic waste everywhere, that's really not going to turn out to be best for everyone. And so this principle of stewardship in Catholic social teaching really aims to strike a balance, right? It's not going to say human beings have no role in it. Everything should be pristine and without human influence. But at the same time, it says we do need to limit and temper our commercial activities and our technological activities in order to preserve the natural world, right? Both for its own sake and for the sake of other people. And so the challenge here is, again, to find a balance. How do we promote the real good of people, which requires food, which requires clothing and housing and all these different things that you need natural resources for? How do we balance that with also recognizing that preserving nature and the natural world is a good and is something that will be important for future generations? And again, that's where that principle of prudence comes in. The Catholic Church doesn't have a list of zoning regulations that it's going to propose. Instead, it says we need to keep this value of stewardship in mind when we're making our decisions. And so it's not going to simply say, whatever is going to turn the greatest profit, that's what we should do. It's going to say, we need to take the bigger picture and think about what's really going to be the best for all people involved in this decision, which includes future generations as well. So finally, we are to the last page. And here on the last page, the principle we're going to be concluding with is the preferential option for the poor. Now, in some ways, this is a kind of peculiar principle. It's a lot more wordy than some of the others that we've seen so far. But also, in a particular way, the preferential option for the poor kind of brings together a bunch of the other principles into kind of useful shorthand, if you will, right? That this is really the principle, I think, that gets perhaps brought up the most in a lot of the literature or by social activists, because really pursuing the preferential option for the poor is typically going to include all the other principles that we've been talking about, or at least many of the other principles that we've been talking about up to this point. All right, so what does a preferential option for the poor mean? Well, again, we're talking about social context here, right? We're making decisions as voters or consumers or investors, trying to figure out how to organize our government or our business. When we're making these choices, preferential option for the poor says we should always choose a course of action that is going to include a preferential option for the poor, that we should do something that is going to benefit the poor, right? And we should really, in some ways, begin our decision-making process by thinking about, okay, we're trying to decide how to, organize our workforce or revise voting laws or whatever it might be. The first thing we should ask is, okay, well, how can we do this in a way that's going to benefit the poor? Right now, why is it that we should do this, right? Again, for a lot of people, this is going to have all kinds of political connotations, but that's not what is going on here, right? Why do we have a preferential option for the poor, right? It's not because rich people are bad or that the poor are somehow more valuable than other people in some way, right? This is, again, it just goes back to those basic ideas of human dignity and that everybody has an intrinsic value that needs to be respected. And so when we are making policy decisions, in whatever kind of context it might be, we should start by asking, well, what's going to benefit the poor? Because our goal in making our decisions, right, should be to promote the real good of everyone, right? So we need to make a choice that is going to really benefit everyone affected by our government or by our company. But I think, as we all know, if we have any kind of experience with reality in any of these spheres, when we're making when these decisions are being made, the rich people tend to do a pretty good job of making sure that they are taken care of, right? That you don't often end up in situations where rich and politically powerful are going to get really railroaded by a particular decision. There's always ways that they're going to exert influence to make sure that they are going to benefit from whatever policy choice is being made, right? The same is not true for the poor, right? The poor are going to be the ones who, in almost every situation, are going to have the least voice in the decision-making process. And so, just as a standard rule of thumb, given the way the world works, the poor, the middle class, the people who have access to education and can write to their congressmen and are part of different other groups that are going to influence social decisions, they're going to be taken care of, right? But the poor tend to not be involved in this process. So our rule of thumb is to say, recognizing this fact, let's start from the outset. How can we make sure the poor are going to be helped by this decision? And then the other things are going to almost certainly follow along more or less naturally. And so again, what is this going to mean practically? Right? This is going to mean when we are investors or owners or managers in a company, the first order of business when making a decision shouldn't necessarily be what is going to produce the greatest profit, right? It ought to be what can we do that's really going to benefit our lowest wage employees, or how can we produce our product, a good quality product at a lower price, not necessarily just so we can increase our profits, but also so that we can really provide something of real value to the poor. And again, this doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong to make a profit, right? And all of the Catholic social teaching literature is going to recognize that businesses need to make a profit in order to be sustainable. But that can't be and shouldn't be our primary goal. Our primary goal should really be helping people, promoting the good of people, and then we make a profit along with that in order to keep our business running. Now again, in the real world, there are going to be certain necessities of business, right? That you need to have a certain amount of profit to reinvest in capital, to do all these other things. And certainly you would have to make those judgments. But it would be, what it's advocating is a shift in our priorities, a shift in the way we think about what is it we're really doing here. What we really ought to be doing is caring for the good of people. And we can begin by focusing on what is most going to help the poor, the powerless, the marginalized in our society. All right, so preferential option for the poor really kind of sums up all these other principles of Catholic social teaching. So it's a good place to wrap up our module as well. It will be, as I've said on all the previous modules, we'll be seeing how these principles play out when we look at kind of the specific issues that we're going to focus on in 21st century American food systems. So if you don't have all of this nailed down exactly at the moment, that's okay. Now next time we will be looking at that overview of 20th century agriculture from the Konkin textbook, Revolution Down on the Farm. So if you, hopefully you've had a start on that book already. If not, I would suggest you get working on it, because we're going to be doing a one module overview of that book and kind of talking about some of the things that we can draw from it in the next module. But until then, I look forward to your own thoughts and comments and questions on why.